welcome to my presentation, Make a Game Today, how many games can help you get into the games industry. So first off, a little introduction. I'm Adam Kelly, I'm a senior gameplay engineer at Playground Games. I'm doing a lot of the programming of interfaces of what makes a game a game. Gameplay is a really hard term to define, so come ask me afterwards if you're confused by it. I've been in the industry for about 10 years, from student placement and then student graduate, and then I've been at Playground ever since. And that translates to me making quite a lot of games. This is my professional portfolio, starting with Driver San Francisco at Ubisoft Reflections in Newcastle. And then when I joined Playground for Horizon 1, their first open world racing game. And all of the DLC and other stuff culminating in Forza Horizon 4 last year or the year before, one of those. But I'm not here to talk about those. I'm here to talk about jam games. So these are 5-minute experiences you can create, mostly focused on a single mechanic or one or two different bits of, well, is that boosting now? Anyway, focused on a single game mechanic or two. Usually you make these things in days rather than weeks or months, or even years in professional case. And I've made about 20 so far, which averages about twice a year. I'll take some time out to do this. Here's a calendar, which you can find on a website called indiegamejams.com, which collates a massive list of all the different sort of competitions or jams you can get involved with. Everything from and this is today, the 7-day roguelike challenge, which started this weekend, which I've always wanted to do, but I've never got around to doing it. Something as small as an hour. I mean, it's quite hard to think of what you can do in an hour, but when everyone's constrained to 1 hour, it makes for some quite interesting output. All the way down to Decade Jam, which I don't see the point of, but it's there anyway, if you wanted to get involved with that. So loads of interesting things happening. Namely, I'm invested in Ludum Dare, which happens 2 or 3 times a year, usually in winter and spring. And that's a weekend-long or 3-day challenge. And there's also the Global Game Jam, which happens every January, which some people call January. Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. That's also a weekend game, normally team-based. But yeah, you can see there's just a swath. Whenever you're interested in making something but don't quite know what, this is a great website to go to get some inspiration. As a hobby, I didn't actually start making games until I went to university. And I made a bunch of prototypes before I actually finished anything. This was one of my first ones where I was like, all right, I want to finish a game. So I heard about Ludum Dare as an idea of just starting and ending in one weekend, just dedicate my entire weekend to it. My idea was Tetris, but with full physics. It didn't quite work, and I didn't finish it, but it got me hooked. So next time, Ludum Dare 18, about 4 months afterwards, I entered this weird game where you jump on a platform, you're chased by a big angry beast, and the idea was, so the theme was enemies as weapons, so the idea here was to jump on these little green bean guys and push them into his gullet so that he gets pushed off the map, and you've got to reach safety. This was probably the first game I ever completed. It was really janky, but it did all right. Came in the top 50%. This was in my portfolio, and that was the important thing, that I had a relatively finished game start to end when I started looking for my student internships. And not many people at the time actually had games in their portfolio when they were applying for these student placements. So this really was a big factor in me getting hired at Ubisoft for a year. Next time around, Ludum Dare 19, I was still hooked. I made this weird thing whilst I was at Ubisoft, and I got a few other Ubisoft people to join in and make stuff. Theirs wasn't as good as mine. The idea here was to use like a gravity gun to pick up bits of food and chuck them at the faces, and they'll only like the ones that are matching what their actual secret desires are. And this time I focused a lot on audio, which comes out great in this presentation format. So it actually did pretty well in this particular category, and from then on I've started always focusing on the strengths of my skill set. Still looks terrible, it's really janky, didn't work half the time, but I was definitely improving. It was about this time I discovered Unity. Before this point, it was mostly like a Mac program. Didn't really have much of export platforms. But around this time, it got really good. You could export your games to web browsers or have them stand alone on a bunch of different platforms. You could write it in C#, which is one of my favorite programming languages. And the way you orient all the components of the engine that you're making means that everything is very highly reusable. And it's really good as a prototyping tool. And it became my go-to from here on in. So I threw away my old C++ engine, which I just could not keep up with the pace of all the features that something like this gave me. So I abandoned it. A few games later, when I was actually finally getting used to Unity, this was the first one I made after I got hired. It was literally a couple of months after I started work there. It was at this point that Ludum Dare and game jams in general blew up as an idea. We went from 200 entries, 300 entries to over 1,000. Like, I think we're now encroaching like in the multiple thousands now. The theme of this one was Tiny World. So I made a tiny little cowboy planet. I called it Westworld before I realized that was actually a thing. And I simplified a lot of the graphics. Everyone's just a little weird rectangle shape that I just bounced up and down. And the idea was you lasso the bandits and you take them to jail and you shoot the zombies and you protect the townsfolk. And that was quite fun. I really enjoyed that one. A couple of years later, this was my attempt at getting more people involved in making game jams and entering game jams at Playground Games. So I organized an event actually in the studio with all the people in the studio to help, and we made a bunch of games. This was the one that I worked on. The idea here was to make a competitive local multiplayer game, which was really hot at the time, where you just run around and you paint the color that you're associated with across the whole city. And the more of the city that's your color, the more likely you are to finish at the end. Coincidentally, about a couple of months afterwards, Nintendo announced Splatoon, which was essentially the exact same game. So I'm a bit bitter about that.
So that's how you round it up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I haven't got my money's worth from that yet. I've also not bought that game, just out of pure spite. For some reason, this got featured in Edge on their website. I think it was a really slow news day. Can't really say much more about that. So, going on another couple of entries, Ludum Dare 26 came around, and literally 4 days before the competition, I received my Oculus Rift dev kit, which is strapped to my wife's face here. I quickly learned that I get incredibly nauseous, and I heard that travel sickness pills worked out, and they definitely helped me throughout the whole weekend. It was actually quite weird going to Boots and asking for travel sickness pills, and then they asked me how far I was traveling, and then having to say, well, physically, not very far, but mentally, very, very far. I don't think she really knew what I was talking about. I almost gave up on Scratch. The first idea I had was you going onto like this planet in VR and running around and like seeing loads of monsters and catching them, and it kind of all spiraled out of control, and I almost gave up. And the second day out of 2, I just started again. I made a simple maze. You've got to get to the end of the maze, but there's these weird little balls that are around, and if you look at them, they're safe. If you don't look at them, they're not safe. So you're always just paranoid, like looking around, trying to find where these things are. And it was pretty fun. I quite enjoyed I promise this isn't just a showcase of all the terrible games I've made. There's some actual good things coming up. This is one I made last year or the year before. I decided, screw graphics, I'm not very good at them. I'm going to make a text adventure. I found a good library for scripting text adventures called Ink, and it's incredibly powerful. I made a game which was inspired by Alien-style consoles. I was playing Alien Isolation at the time, so I made a horror in space themed thing where even though it's just a text adventure, you're actually entering rooms and exiting rooms and going around pushing all these buttons. And I also had a good focus on audio, so I recently got a hardware keyboard that I was playing around with, and I made all the sound effects and all the music on that, and I ingrained it in. Again, I wish I could show it off, but GIFs. This actually came top 10 in 2 categories. Bear in mind, this is like 800, 900 entries. And I was so pleased with that turnout. I came top 10 in mood and audio. That was really fun. This is the last game I made for, I think it was last summer. This is Asteroids with a Small Twist. The theme was your life is currency. So the idea was you pick up little coins, and whenever you get hit by an asteroid, it knocks them out Sonic style, and you have to collect them all back up. But you can also use those coins to add power-ups, so you see these little green shields, little blue shields. You can also get speed-ups, power-ups and stuff. I focused on just making it as polished as I possibly could without adding new features, just focusing on the core, flying around, shooting stuff. And I think that really shows off, even though, again, GIF quality and some weird trailing, but whatnot. Yeah, that was really fun to work on. So, what can you actually learn from doing this as a hobby? There are actually a bunch of key skills that have come in to become very important for my day-to-day life at Playground and as a games industry professional. The first is scoping, which is figuring out how long it takes to make a feature from scratch. This is something that's basically vital because as a person in the trenches developer, you're the one who's actually coming up with the estimates on how long tasks will take and filling the backlog and the schedule with all the things that need to happen. So being able to identify a feature and saying, this is going to take me 2 days or 3 hours or a month is really important. Sometimes it can just feel more like an art where you just throw numbers and just hope it sticks. But there is the ability to break things down, and the more granular your estimates are, the more accurate they'll be. So here's a mock-up I made of Mario. You can use that mock-up to identify the key features in whatever game you're making. This is something I tend to do at the very start. Once I've come up with my idea for a game to make, I'll just load up Paint and try within a minute to just draw what the thing is I want to make. And then literally just assign arrows to say, here's a feature I need to make, here's a feature I need to make, here's a feature I need to make. And for each one I pointed out, I try and break it down. So for example, the jumping would be, I need the physics to push the person up, I need the sound for whatever the sound jumping make, I'll need to add trails, and then I'll also need some form of collision for getting back on the ground and whatnot. So I will do that for basically every single bit of the feature I can sort of identify from a mock-up. And at the end, I will just double my estimate because nothing ever works out in game development. Everything will take longer. It can be disheartening, but if you double your estimates, you account for that. So thinking about the ideas for a theme for a particular jam. Most of them have themes involved. You'll maybe get a keyword or several keywords, or in some cases, you'll get a weird hieroglyph or an audio file or whatnot. One of the Global Game Jam ones was just the sound of a beating heart, which was really hard to work with. So I generally tend to come up with a bunch of different ideas before I commit to one single thing. because normally the first thing that comes into my head will be something that everyone else would have thought about. It would be like something very, very cookie cutter. But usually when I'm starting to scrape the bottom of a barrel of ideas, I get to really weird places in my head, and they end up being relatively unique. And this is useful in day-to-day life because you can approach a question from several different angles rather than just what's the first to the easiest approach. So an example here is a theme called growing. First idea, farming game, grow plants. Next idea, some sort of idea of growing up, life through school or whatnot. Next idea, some sort of weird Katamari mashup where you're just rambling through a field, picking things up and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Perhaps it's about growing friendships. Friendship. Or maybe you want to make a first-person shooter, but you want to incorporate the theme somehow, so you make it so that every time you shoot someone, you get a bit larger or smaller or something, which is actually a game that Ubisoft released a couple of years ago. You want to get your key features working as soon as possible for a global game jam or any sort of mini game, usually within the first couple of hours. Because if you've only got 2 days to work on something, and if you spend the entire first day without getting your key features working, then when you come to implement them and they're not fun, you've kind of in a bit of a rut. So the idea with this is to just try and fail as fast as possible. This is the first playable for the first game I made for any game jam, which was just static pictures I just made in 60 seconds in Paint, and a debug line that just had you going. So the jumping and the stomping and stuff was done within a couple of hours. This is also something that we do in the industry a lot. First playable is a very key milestone for very large games to ensure that all the elements of the game design come together and work in harmony rather than detriment each other. Play to your strengths. If you are good at modeling stuff, then use that and try and just make as many pretty stuff as you can. Keep everything else simple. If you're not good at drawing, just do what I do and just use Paint. Just as long as it's consistently art style, it doesn't tend to be so bad. Or abandon it entirely, just make a text adventure. If you don't really know about sound and generating sounds, or and writing sounds, there's a lot of programs out there which you can author that by just pressing a random button. It will just give you some bleep bloop sounds. Coding's not your strength. There's a bunch of game engines that are pretty good at it. Unreal's alright, but it can be really overwhelming. I tend to recommend Construct for 2D games because it's it's a much less harsh learning curve. And yeah, or you can use this opportunity to say, I'm going to take a weekend. I'm not necessarily going to submit a finished, polished product, but I'm going to use this to learn one of these things that I'm not very good at. It's important for these events, especially when there's a community involved, to try and blog. Every time you do something that you are excited about, if you shout about it and other people like it, it's very morale boosting. It also creates natural breakpoints to kind of just put your game aside and start thinking about, where's this going? Is this going in the right direction? Is this still fun? Yeah, I post quite a lot. Crunch. So crunch is the idea of working over excessively to hit key deadlines or to finish a game. There's a lot of news around about certain developers treating their staff terribly and going overtime a lot. Playground's getting very, very good at controlling crunch and stopping things from getting out of hand. I've never done an all-nighter on a game jam. 20, 30 odd games. I've never done an all-nighter. I've always gone to bed maybe midnight or something and getting up in reasonable times. And I'll finish it 5 hours early so I can spend an evening with my family. Sleep also helps you sort of reconnect and refresh and come back to a problem with new ideas. If you find that you're running out of time or struggling to get everything you want, just cut stuff. Just rescope it, redesign the game so that you can finish it in time. and it just has no place in modern games development as a thing. So you shouldn't definitely shouldn't be doing it as part of a jam or a hobby. And importantly, don't give up. If you're not enjoying it, you can come back to it next time. Go to a different competition. There's a lot to be learned from finishing a product. Generally, if you're in the industry, you'll only finish a game once every 2-3 years. But when you're doing this, you're getting into that finalization stage, 3 to 4 times every year. And I found that I've been able to apply a lot of that to my job in the industry because I'm seeing it so much more often than everyone else in my team. But there's also a lot to be learned from failures. Whenever you fail to do something, you can run a post-mortem, try and figure out what went wrong, what could have gone better for you. Here's a list of recommended tools, which I find quite useful. Obviously Unity, but I'm starting to think about other engines I can move to, which might give me more what I want. There's programs like this, which generate sounds for you. For example, we have a bunch of gamey sounds. You press the button, it mutates all these settings and gives you like something that sounds like a pickup being picked up. And there's a button, you press it, gives you the sound file. So you can generate all of the sounds for your game within like 60 seconds just by pressing one of each of these buttons and export it. That's really powerful. There's a hosting platform called itch.io, which is where I generally publish all the games I make. They have a built-in web browser and search engine and a whole bunch of other really, really useful features. So I definitely recommend that. If you're writing text adventures, Inkscript's a good shout. I really liked it when I was using it. I'm going to make more stuff again with it. If you don't like drawing or painting or whatever, then Paint.net is a bit better than Paint. And I use that almost exclusively. And Blender, it's free. You can make models. I can't really say anything about it. I'm terrible at modeling, but maybe Blender is for you. Who knows? Yeah. So that's pretty much it. If you want to look at the sort of roles we have that might be interest of you in the future, please go to playground-games.com/careers, and you'll see all the roles that we're currently looking for, and you'll see all the skill sets we're expecting of people of those levels. If you want to get in touch with me after today, then that's my Twitter address. I don't post very interesting things often or at all, but that might be helpful to someone. So yeah, anyone got any questions?
Thank you, Adam. Those who do have questions, I need to hand the mic over to you just for recordings.
Okay.
That's why I'm doing this bit now. But awesome, thank you for that. Who has questions? Yep, if you can speak to the mic, please.
When and how did you make your portfolio?
I started about 6 months before I was applying for jobs. In terms of actually building a CV and things to send over, and I was well before I was actually due to be working for someone. So for example, at Ubisoft, I was sending out CVs in December when I was meant to be starting in like June. And that is super early, but that also shows that you're super keen. And at that point, I had about 2 or 3 different demos I was chucking around.
What sort of things do you put on your portfolio?
Anything that you find is interesting or shows off some skills that you have acquired, really.
Thank you. Any other questions, Tom? Okay, yes, Alfie. Please.
When you're doing a game jam, what would you say is like the ideal sort of team size? So how many sort of people would you consider the best to work with?
Most of these examples, apart from the playground one, I did by myself. I've done teams of 2, I've done teams of 3, I've done teams of 5. Generally I find 2 or 3 is good. The more heads you have in, the more you can get done, but then you need to start thinking about organizing people. and I find that to be like, especially for game developers, like organizing cats, it's hard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
What's helped you when it comes to working in teams?
Working in teams is like 90% communication and 10% doing stuff. Just as long as you're just constantly talking about what you're doing, the problems you're having, you make sure that no one takes a wrong step at all.
What software do you use, if any, to keep track?
Keep track.
So if there's a task your team needs to do, like a tick list, right? Is there any software that you use?
I've never really done that. I tend to just talk to people and say, what are you doing?
Thank you. One more on the other side. Yeah.
What's your favourite part about working at Playground Games?
Favorite part about working at Playground? I think it's the projects, really, and that we get the ability to work on very high caliber products, but we're also not a massive team. Like, Ubisoft employs like thousands of people to work on Assassin's Creed. We have maybe about 100 and something working in-house on Forza.
Thank you.
And yeah, there's all sorts of really cool activities outside of work. I'm doing stuff with work at like 3-4 times a week. It's awesome.
Thank you. Any more questions?
What is your what's the recommended software to like create pixel games?
Pixel games.
Yeah.
I've never really done that. I think I tried to make pixel art using an editor called Pickle at one point, which is like a web-based pixel art browser, but I've never done anything amazing. I'm not an artist.
What about just like 2D games then?
2D games. Paint? I don't know, sorry.
Alright, then that's fine.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, I'm going back again. Let's do this.
What? So you're a programmer, right? What programming languages did you start off with, and what are you using right now?
I learnt C++ going into university
How long did that take?
to learn it.
Yeah.
I'm still learning it. It's for sort of like AAA games, and it tends to be the de facto standard for writing software because of the performance and the controlling of memory. I prefer C#. I think that's a much happier place to be.
Thank you. Any more questions? Anyone else? Okay, I have questions myself as well. Currently these guys are students at college levels, A levels. What's your opinion on progressing onto things like university for games? Does it necessarily, do they have to do it, or are there other options?
I think there are always other options. Like, most of the time we're looking at projects rather than, whether you got a C in chemistry. I got turned down for a job because I had a C in chemistry one time. It was nuts. So I do recommend university because they give you the skills and the discipline required for writing good software. That's their job, to teach you how to write good software or make good 3D models or whatever. But if you're diligent and you do a lot of tutorials on the internet and learn some solid things, not just about the specific field that you're working on, but games as a whole, making stuff, you could go a really long way.
Awesome, thank you. Any more questions from anyone else? I have more. Awesome. If students want to start applying for positions, what sort of positions or jobs would you think they best start applying for? Like, what sort of levels, what sort of job ads should they be aiming for at this level?
What sort of job ads?
Yeah, it's like what sort of level of positions at companies?
A lot of places open graduate internships. We tend to have a couple of roles every year, so we'll have a couple of grads each year. I'm not quite sure of the details about that. But yeah, there are a lot of graduate level internships you can get. Ubisoft are quite good at it. Yeah.
Are there any internships that aren't graduate level, like post-college level, if you're already a graduate?
I'm not quite sure. It's not really something I'm involved with too much. Sorry.
Awesome. I've got one more question. I promise I won't take up too much time. What's one thing that you've learned by being at Playground or being with developers that you wish you learned much sooner? Now these guys could probably benefit from now. Sorry about that one. It's a bit of a difficult one, putting you on the spot.
I think it's important to be very good at communication. Like when I joined the industry, I was very, very quiet. And I did my job, I stayed in my own little world and didn't really tell anyone about what I was doing or what was going on. That changed like about halfway through, and I found myself way more productive just talking to people.
I'm sure many students probably struggle with communications, getting yourself out there. Are there any sort of tips and tricks or events that you might be aware of that might help them out with kind of social skills and getting out there, communicating?
Yeah, give random presentations to public speaking courses maybe, join a band.
So just generally kind of put yourself out there and just kind of being a part of society a little bit.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that. That's opportunities then. Anyone got any more questions?